Africa speaks back. The voice, the truth, the continent on its own terms.
Africa has spoken. Now pass it on. Subscribe, like, share.
In the last 48 hours, a young West African captain and Interpol did what many thought was impossible. They shut down one of the largest synthetic drug routes ever recorded in the Sahel, 10,000 kilos of amphetamines, hidden under the logo of humanitarian aid. But this isn't just about drugs. It's about how aid, diplomacy, and trust can be turned into a smuggler's dream, and why this one bust is echoing all the way from Ouagadougou to New York. And here's the shocker. The trail doesn't end in Africa. It leads straight to organizations in Europe once praised as lifesavers. Before we go further, I want you to think about this. Have you ever trusted something just because it came with a good cause label? Drop your story or your honest take in the comments, because this isn't just news, it's about the choices we all make and the blind spots we allow. I'm Traore, and you're watching Africa Speaks Back. We tell Africa's stories the way they should be told, real, unfiltered, and connected to the bigger picture that affects all of us, whether you're in Atlanta, Accra, or Amsterdam. Stay with me, because what happened next wasn't just a police operation. It was a decision in the middle of the night that would rewrite the rules of an entire region. At 2:12 a.m., the Sahel Regional Command in Ouagadougou lit up with a coded alert. A convoy had slipped past Malian checkpoints with no plates, no transponders, and no hesitation. On paper, this route was low risk, a forgotten petroleum corridor from the days of French operations. In reality, it was the kind of backdoor no one questions until something goes wrong. And this time, it wasn't just a smuggling path, it was moving under the logos of European aid groups. The manifest claimed seed grain and fertilizer, but infrared scans told a different story. Cargo holds radiating steady heat, impossible for fragile crops. If you've ever stored garden seeds, you know they hold warmth. They don't generate it. Here's where it gets unsettling. From 2015 to 2020, the Sahel averaged 13 kilos of cocaine seized each year. By 2022, that number jumped to over 1/4. Now, in one hit, they were looking at 10,000 kilos of something far stronger. Patterns like that make you ask, is this just chance or is someone turning up the tap? For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this wasn't about hunches. He'd seen this movie before. Convoys draped in good intentions, sliding through humanitarian corridors. No one dared to check. And if you think about it, most people, in the US or anywhere, are wired to trust what looks official. Slap on a charity logo and the average person lowers their guard. But what if that reflex is exactly what someone's counting on? The order he gave was calculated, but risky. Track them, don't stop them. Not until they cross into Burkina Faso. Because one wrong move in Malian airspace could ignite a diplomatic fire. And Traoré knew the real prize was catching them where the law was his to enforce. It's a human instinct to want to act fast, to catch the bad guy the second you see him. But sometimes, waiting is the harder, smarter move. If you move too soon, you get nothing. Wait just long enough, and you get it all. As the night bled into morning, the convoy crept south, dust curling off the tires, GPS pings sharpening on the digital map. In the ops room, every second dragged, until the first truck's shadow crossed the border, and the air in command shifted from quiet watchfulness to something far heavier. What came next would test not just the trucks on that road, but the limits of how far one nation could go when the rules were written to keep it looking the other way. Shutting down an international border without warning is the kind of move most governments won't even consider. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did it in the middle of the day, for 6 straight hours. Every crossing sealed. Aid trucks, commercial freight, even diplomatic convoys. No exceptions, no courtesy calls to foreign embassies. In West African politics, that's not just unusual, it's almost unthinkable. From the control room, orders rippled out to 12 outposts. Radio chatter turned sharp, satellite relays lit up, and for the first time in years, Burkina Faso's northern line became a wall instead of a door. Here's the irony. In most Western capitals, border closures are framed as acts of sovereignty. In West Africa, they're often framed as instability. So, what happens when a nation closes its border not out of panic, but out of purpose? The risk was real. If the cargo turned out to be legitimate aid, Traore would face international backlash overnight. It's the kind of gamble most leaders avoid, especially when the stakes are both political and personal. And this is where human behavior kicks in. Most of us, when the choice is between safe for me and right for everyone, lean toward the safe option. He chose the opposite. By hour 2, the convoy was boxed in, just meters inside Burkina Faso territory. Drivers refused dialogue, engines cut, doors locked. The standoff wasn't loud, but it was electric, because everyone in that moment understood the next move could rewrite the rules for how aid moves across Africa. Think about this. In your own life, when you draw a line, there's always a cost. Draw it too late, and you lose credibility. Draw it too soon, and you risk everything you've built. Here, the line was drawn at the exact moment when the other side thought no one would dare. And that's when the order came down. Initiate the joint operation with Interpol. Not under their leadership, but under Burkina Faso's own command systems. Tech designed by local engineers, intel mapped by regional analysts. It wasn't just a tactical choice. It was a statement that this was Africa's game to play. The call was made, the trap was set, and as the teams moved into position, the atmosphere shifted from political gamble to a hunt in progress. What the drones would uncover next would not only expose the truth about this convoy, but also force some very uncomfortable conversations in cities far from the Sahel. Reconstructing a smuggler's route in 48 hours is almost unheard of. Doing it across 2 countries, with both military and humanitarian traffic mixed in, borders on impossible. Using AI mapping, Traore's team overlaid the convoy's path against years of freight and NGO movement data. The pattern lit up immediately. 3 previous convoys had taken almost the exact same route, with the same gaps at checkpoints and the same unexplained delays. None had declared accurate manifests. All had vanished into the Sahel without inspection. From an intelligence standpoint, that's a red flag you can't ignore. From a human standpoint, it's the kind of detail you only spot when you're willing to connect dots that others wave away. Most people, and most systems, stop looking when the surface story feels good enough. Here, they kept digging. The operation shifted into full motion. 48 soldiers from Burkina Faso's National Counter-Trafficking Unit, 4 Interpol coordinators, and a small analytics cell from Ghana's Cyber Risk Bureau, working out of mobile data vans, pulling satellite time codes to catch evasive patterns. Hours into the surveillance, a fixed-wing drone caught something the paperwork never mentioned. Containers marked as agricultural lime were giving off high, stable heat signatures. For anyone who's handled lime in bulk, you know it doesn't burn from the inside out. Whatever was inside was alive in a way raw minerals aren't. On the ground, the extraction was surgical. Under 20 minutes, no resistance on a damage-bound cargo. Cryo cutters slid through the seals, lids came off. And the scene inside told its own story. Beneath hollow sacks of mineral powder, slabs of synthetic amphetamines stacked in tight, cold precision. 10,000 kilograms in total, lab-purified, worth close to $90 million on European streets. That's the tangible what, but there's always a who and a why trailing behind. Labels pointed to a Luxembourg-based aid broker, with no public staff, no working phone, and a masked domain website. It's one thing to fake paperwork. It's another to build an entire facade convincing enough to pass for humanitarian relief. If you've ever trusted a brand because it looked legit, you know the danger here. The better the disguise, the less likely anyone is to check. In this case, the disguise wasn't just good. It was built to exploit every inspection loophole on the books. And just when they thought they had the full picture, 2 unregistered surveillance drones appeared in the sky, circling the operation in a double orbit, their altitude and signal profile matching high-grade defense contractor models from Europe. Someone somewhere wasn't just watching the bust happen, they were mapping it. The team now had proof of the cargo, proof of the route, and a new unanswered question hovering in the air. Who else had a stake in keeping this convoy moving? Finding 10 tons of synthetic drugs under aid packaging is one kind of revelation. Finding the paperwork that made it legal to move them is another level entirely. Inside the seized cargo, investigators pulled contracts stamped with the name Agri-Development West Africa, on the surface a European NGO dedicated to post-conflict agricultural recovery. But the registration led to an anonymous office suite in Luxembourg. No listed staff, no phone, a website masked behind privacy services. The deeper they went, the stranger it got. Financial records linked the NGO to a Swiss conglomerate with stakes in pharmaceutical supply chains and a history of export violations involving stimulant precursors. One board member had even served on a European medicines policy task force. Then came the clause that stopped everyone cold. Contents exempt from internal inspection to preserve temperature-sensitive bioexperimental materials. In plain language, that meant chemical cargo could cross multiple borders without being opened, as long as it was labeled scientific. If you think about it, most people, whether in the US, Europe, or Africa, are trained to step back when science is mentioned. We assume the experts know best. We don't question what's sealed in the box. That reflex is powerful and dangerous when it's written into law. The contract bore a third-party verification stamp from Malta, tied to past falsified agricultural certificates in North Africa, and the shipment manifests used phrases straight from old DEA reports on diluted cocaine routes in Latin America. Biosynthetic media, experimental stimulant substrate, non-human field trial compound. This wasn't sloppy criminal paperwork. It was a blueprint, designed to hide contraband in plain sight, under the cover of humanitarian goodwill. For Traoré's team, the drugs were proof of a crime. The documents were proof of a system. And systems don't change just because one shipment gets stopped. They change when someone's willing to break the silence around how they actually work. The evidence was on the table, but the decision on how to handle it would determine whether this was just a headline or the start of something much harder to roll back. When the evidence went public, the reaction from foreign capitals was fast and split. Paris called for a confidential dialogue. Brussels expressed regret over a breach of trust. But on the ground in Ouagadougou, Traoré wasn't taking calls. He was preparing a press statement. Here's what made it sting. In the Western press, the story wasn't framed as the largest synthetic drug bust in West African history. It was framed as a misunderstanding over humanitarian aid. Words like overreaction, unfounded suspicion, and diplomatic breach started surfacing in op-eds. Not one major outlet led with the amphetamine purity levels or the surveillance drone footage. This is a familiar pattern if you've followed global news. When the facts are messy, the narrative often gets cleaned up for public comfort. And most people in America or anywhere else consume the headline, not the footnotes. If the headline says aid seized, the mind rarely jumps to $90 million in synthetic drugs. NGOs weighed in. A coalition claimed the seized materials were medical devices for fertility programs in underserved regions. The letter, signed in Brussels, accused Burkina Faso of jeopardizing vital health partnerships. From their perspective, this was a loss. Resources delayed, trust fractured. From Traoré's perspective, letting it pass would mean opening the door for every other shipment to hide behind the same excuse. So he stepped up to the podium, faced more than 100 journalists, and spoke just 3 lines. This is not aid. This is murder with a logo, and I will not apologize for defending my soil. No additional remarks, no Q&A, just silence. Silence in moments like this is rarely empty. It's the pause that forces people to choose a side. Supporters saw defiance, critics saw arrogance. And if you've ever been in a standoff, in a boardroom, a courtroom, even a family dinner, you know that once the silence drops, the next word spoken can shift the entire room. Within hours, social media lit up. Hashtags jumped borders. Protest clips rolled from Accra to New York. What started as a regional operation was now a global conversation. If you've been watching so far, ask yourself, when it's your turn to draw the line, will you speak or will you stay silent? The wave of public opinion was building, and in the capitals of Africa, some leaders were already deciding how far they were willing to ride it. Support from Africa didn't trickle in. It arrived like a front line forming. Within days, Ghana's president, Nana Akufo-Addo, publicly affirmed Burkina Faso's right to investigate any cargo on its soil. In Mali, leaders went further, calling Traore a necessary flame in a region long smothered by hypocrisy. This wasn't the usual diplomatic politeness. These were heads of state staking political capital on a position that could strain ties with Europe. And that's the thing about solidarity. It's easiest when it costs nothing. Here, it came with real trade risks, aid risks, and reputational risks. The African Union began pushing for a regional database of exempt cargoes. Algeria and Chad offered legal teams to review past shipments. Interpol signed a 5-year data-sharing protocol that, for the first time, would treat West African humanitarian routes with the same scrutiny as high-risk narcotics corridors in Latin America. If you think about it, most people measure support by words. In geopolitics, it's measured by resources and exposure. Pledging drones, airspace, and satellite access isn't charity, Pascam. It's a declaration. For Burkina Faso, the shift was visible on the ground. Border agents who once waved trucks through without a glance were now checking seals, running scanners, calling in field chemists when something didn't match the manifest. Before, the habit was speed. Keep the aid moving, avoid the delay. Now, the habit was caution. Verify first, move later. Change like that doesn't come from a memo. It comes from a moment that forces everyone to decide whether they're willing to be the person who looks away. Most of us, in our own jobs, have faced smaller versions of this. Do you flag the irregularity and risk the fallout? Or do you pass it along because that's how it's always been? On the streets of Ouagadougou, the political story was abstract. At the border, it was tactile. Hands on cargo, eyes on the scanner, the quiet nod when something cleared. And while the solidarity was strengthening, there were still unspoken calculations about how far each ally was willing to go if the pressure dialed up. The new border checkpoints weren't built for show. They were built to see through anything. 11 key crossings across the Sahel belt were now fitted with mobile adaptive scanners, capable of penetrating steel containers, fuel tanks, and insulated NGO shipments. The rules had flipped. No matter the origin, no matter the logo, every shipment would be inspected. It didn't matter if it carried a foreign flag or came from a trusted donor. In a region where free lanes for friendly partners had been the norm for decades, this was a cultural reset. For the people working those gates, the shift was personal. Before, the job was to keep the line moving. Speed was the metric, not scrutiny. Now the measure of competence was how many inconsistencies you caught. And that change, from throughput to vigilance, rewired the daily rhythm of the border. One morning in Gorum, a truck labeled as anti-pest liquid for reforestation rolled into inspection. On paper, nothing about it stood out, but the scanner lit up with a dense chemical signature. Field tests revealed synthetic methylamine at a purity level exceeding European industrial regulations. That's the part that hits hardest. How many times had shipments like this crossed without a second look? It's the kind of question that lingers because it's not just about this convoy. It's about every unchecked moment in the past. In human terms, it's the same choice anyone faces when they find a flaw in a system they work in. Do you stop and address it, knowing it will slow things down, or do you let it slide because the task in front of you feels too big? Most people, most of the time, choose to let it slide. Here, the choice was made to stop, even if it meant confrontation. And as more trucks were pulled aside, as more seals were cut, and more manifests were challenged, the sense grew that this was no longer just a national operation. It was the opening act of something larger. What began as a single border bust was now forcing institutions far outside West Africa to explain themselves. The World Health Organization issued a cautious statement about balancing transparency with humanitarian flow, but it stopped short of addressing the intercepted drugs directly. The more the facts came out, the more the framing shifted. This was no longer a story about aid. It was about sovereignty. It was about whether a nation has the right to question what enters its territory, even when it arrives under a flag of goodwill. In South Africa, investigative journalists began tracing similar shipping routes. In Kenya, transparency watchdogs dug into past exemption records. Patterns emerged. Exemptions signed in cities far from the cargo's origin. Approval stamps routed through shell companies in places most citizens couldn't find on a map. If you think about it, most people assume rules are the same for everyone. But in trade and diplomacy, rules bend, and sometimes break, depending on who's asking and who's watching. That's the uncomfortable part. It's not always about what the law says, but about who can use it as cover. For the people of Burkina Faso, the change was tangible. Before, foreign aid convoys were part of the background, trucks you didn't notice unless they blocked your path. Now they were objects of scrutiny, symbols of a larger conversation about who benefits and who bears the risk. Traore's stance had turned a quiet habit into a public principle. Trust is earned, not assumed. And while that principle carried political cost, it also carried a kind of clarity that can't easily be undone. The convoys still rolled, the borders still opened and closed, but somewhere in the space between the checkpoint and the capital, the idea of what help looked like had changed. And once that lens shifts, it's hard to see the road the same way again. So that's the full arc, from a midnight alert in the Sahel to a regional shift in how borders, aid, and trust are handled. Stories like this aren't just headlines. They're case studies in how systems work and how quickly they can be challenged when someone decides not to look the other way. Of course, this is a news-based narrative built on reported facts and verified records. It's not here to tell you what to believe, just to give you the clearest picture I can. From my point of view, it shows that accountability isn't about where you're from, but about whether you're willing to ask questions when the answer might be uncomfortable. I think most people, if given the same evidence, would want to know the truth, but whether they'd act on it, that's where the split happens. If this kind of deep dive matters to you, hit subscribe, drop a like, and share it with someone who still thinks aid is always simple. And I'll see you in the next news breakdown. Different story, same commitment to bringing it to you straight.